Welcome to Paragon Replicas, and today I'm going to show you how I 3D printed and finished the portal gun. Let's get started. Hello everyone, thank you for stopping by the workshop. My name is Mike, and I'm going to be showing you an in-depth look on how I built the portal gun from scratch. We're going to be building this thing with the power of 3D printing and this lovely workshop I have set up here. One last thing before we jump into this build, if you need any additional information, I'll be sure to leave that down in the description below so you can pick up any items that I've listed for you, or if you're curious about the tools and materials that I use, I will link them down below. Alrighty, let's get into it. So the first thing I needed to make this portal gun was the 3D file. So I created mine in Fusion 360. I've been using that program for a while now, and it seems to suit my needs perfectly so far. So it took me about around 4 hours to create the full file, which isn't that long actually at all. Step 2 is to actually print the parts that you need. So I won't be going into too much detail on how to do that in this video, but on a future video I'll be definitely going into how to prep your prints, your files, to be printed the best possible way they can be. So after I add all the pieces, the next step is to sand all the parts. So I start with a 220 grit sandpaper, and you want to sand against the grain of the 3D print. Grain of the 3D print. What do I mean by grain of the 3D print? Well, as the printer prints layer by layer upwards, you get vertical lines that appear between each layer where it's fused together. And you can minimize that with lowering the layer height itself. These are all printed at 0.2 and they look okay. I usually print all my props at 0.2, but if you wanted to, you could print it at a 0.1, you'd get a slightly better finish, but it'll take double the time. But I'm sanding my pieces anyway, so it doesn't really matter as long as I get a good enough resolution overall in general. That's okay for this. So after you do that first initial pass of sanding, the part will lighten up. It'll turn from whatever color it is to a lighter shade of that. And that's a pretty good indication of when you should start thinking about seam lines. So what do I mean by seam lines? Well, for example, this is the front grip of the portal gun. So when it is all finished, it'll look something like this, and this is where you hold it from. But where you stick these pieces together, and I just use super glue. I sand the surfaces first, both surfaces, put a little bit of super glue, and then actually I reinforce it with a little bit of 5-minute epoxy on the back, just so I'm sure it'll stay together and I won't have it crack later on. However, for the top surface, you don't want to see that line in there. So you grab yourself a can of Bondo or a similar product, and for Bondo specifically, it's a 1:10 mix ratio. So you put a little bit of activator in this goop, right? You mix it around, and then you start to apply it over the line. So you want to apply a little bit more than you think you need, and it takes a little bit of getting used to working with Bondo because it's easy to add a whole lot and just be left with too much, but that's just part of the learning process. So you grab your 220 grit and you sand that surface as flush as you possibly can. You won't be able to get it perfectly, usually, because you can't quite see because it's two different colors. It's kind of weird to see. So the next step is to add some filler primer. Filler primer is awesome because it's a self-leveling sandable surface, and it's only like $5 a can. You give that a good solid coat, making sure you're using proper spray paint techniques. A little secret I learned is if you soak these in just hot water from the tap, just from the sink, and you soak them in there for like 5 minutes, you'll get a more consistent paint flow. So it's a little tip for you. So after you give it that good coat of filler primer, it'll all become one color, and you'll be able to see the imperfections more clearly. So this is your opportunity to grab the 220 grit sandpaper again and really start to knock back the lines as well as that seam that you covered. Alrighty, so after your part looks more or less smooth, hit it again with another coat of filler primer. I even go in with a Sharpie and just circle spots where I missed, or where I need to put a little bit more Bondo, or I need to get rid of a little bit more lines. And then I sand it again with a 220 grit sandpaper after the next coat of paint has cured. So we want to be thinking about the finish that we actually want from the final part. So for the example pieces I've been showing you, we want that a high gloss white finish, right? So we've sanded it to a 400 grit. Now I'm actually going to take it up a little bit more to an 800 grit. So then what you can do is actually spray a primer, but for this video we're going to just jump straight into the paint. We're going to just evenly coat some white onto this part right here. And notice how I am not getting full coverage on this first pass. I am intentionally leaving it a little bit splotchy, really thin, not complete coverage, and then I'm going to leave it there for like 5 minutes or so. This will give the paint some time to tack down to the surface, and then the next layer of paint that I'm going to be adding will really bite into that first layer. So it'll stick really well and you'll avoid runs and drips, which can ruin a project really quickly. But if you do get a drip when you're painting, don't worry about it. You can fix it. Just wait for it to fully cure. That's the key. You have to be patient. I know it's easy to want to fix it right away and then you mess it up more because you touch it and it's wet paint and you smear it everywhere. I've done that before. It's a natural process. So just wait for it to fully cure and then take that 220 grit sandpaper again and sand it back to a smooth surface and then bring it back up to 400 and then 800 or whatever grit you want the finish to be. Alrighty, assuming that your painting went well, you can leave that part to the side and rinse and repeat for all the other parts. So specific to this project, the portal gun has a lot of flat black areas. It's kind of like a metallic-y kind of flat black though. It seems like the base of it is made out of metal, but the top surface is like a thin layer of black paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop all the pieces that are black. I'm going to stop sanding at 400 grit, and I'm going to give it a solid coat of flat black spray paint. So we want these parts to read as a real metal piece that's been painted black. So how do we do that? We grab a brush and some silver paint, and we dip our brush into the paint, but we wipe most of the paint off on a rag. We're going to be utilizing a practice called dry brushing. So with a mostly dry brush, it's easy to put too much paint on there, but with a mostly dry brush, this is a slow process. You're going to slowly hit the high points with this brush to kind of build up a metallic-y surface on the high points, so like on edges or on bits that would be touched a lot. And what this will do is create the illusion that the piece is actually metal and that paint is kind of wearing down, and it'll really up the quality of the project you're working with, because you can take a completely flat black surface and make it look as if it's actually a metal piece that's just been painted black, which will look much more realistic. Alrighty, now we're going to talk about the 3 arms that come out of the front of this portal gun. These read slightly more metallic to me. They're kind of like a silvery kind of color, so I kind of want to capture that. So what we're going to do is we're going to sand these arms to a higher grit. I'll probably take it up to about a 1500 more or less, and then after it's at that finish, I'm going to give it a thick coat of glossy black spray paint. Why am I adding this thick coat of glossy black spray paint? Well, we're going to use a special paint that will utilize that bottom surface of glossy black. So we're going to grab our airbrush and we're going to load in some Alclad 2 airframe aluminum paint. It's a lacquer paint. It's ready to go for the airbrush, so you just dump it in there as much as you need. Make sure you screw that cap back on, by the way, because it's really easy to knock those bottles over, so watch out for that. And we're just going to give slow passes of this airframe aluminum onto our glossy black part. And as you can see, the paint really likes this glossy black surface because the shine is incredible. I've never found a different paint that can get a finish this close to a metallic surface. So it's what I use for most projects where I need a metal finish to look really good. However, there is a catch with this type of paint. You have to seal this paint. This paint loves to rub off. It won't rub off immediately or anything like that, but if you touch this piece at all for a while, which you probably will because you'll sit it on your shelf and be like, hey, look what I made, and people will like to touch it. You know, it's a fun conversational piece. So I highly recommend you seal this paint, but do not seal it with a regular sealer. It'll ruin the metallic finish you just put on there. And there's only a few sealers that I've found that work really well to protect the paint but don't dull the shine. I like to use Alclad's Clear Coat, and it's spelled with K's. I'll link to it down below. I'll link all of these things down below for you. So we just want to add a thin sealer coat to this airframe aluminum layer that we've just put down. Also, this paint dries really fast, so give it about 15 minutes in between painting it and then sealing it, and you'll be good to go. And then the sealer itself dries pretty quickly. I think it takes a little bit longer than the actual lacquer itself, but it's still really fast. Alrighty, so now we have those arms done, and we have all the pieces we need that we've 3D printed and finished. So now it's on to figuring out what we're going to make that clear tube out of in the middle. I'm using a polycarbonate as this big clear tube. I found it on eBay. I had to buy like 8 feet of it, I think, just for this, what is that, about a 6-inch section. But to simulate the effect in the game, we have another tube that runs inside of this completely clear tube that glows either orange or blue. So to simulate that effect, I picked up a diffused polycarbonate tube. This one's 30 inches long. This is from a custom saber shop, actually. Now, I've known about these polycarbonate tubes that they sell for a long time now. One of my early props, when I seriously got into prop making, was not this one. This one is much better than my first, but it uses the same polycarbonate tube as the blade of this lightsaber. So I have this lightsaber in silent mode right now, and as you can see, the light at the base is very nice, it's very clear, and as we get to the top, it fades out because there's only one light source in this saber. But even then, only with one light source, still looks pretty good, and we only need it to travel, let's see, about that much. So already that's pretty nice. So having that experience from building a couple lightsabers, I knew that this tube would work great. It's 1 inch in diameter, and this is the thin-walled blade. You can go pick it up in the link below. So now what I needed was to get a way to secure this in the middle. So knowing that I was going to put some sort of clear diffused tube in there, I left a hole down the middle, and then I printed these little couplers after the fact that just slide on the tube, and they slide on very nicely. I have a tolerance set to 0.03 millimeters, and that seems to work perfectly as a tolerance on my 3D printer. Your prints may vary. So now that I know this will fit on this tube, I can cut this tube down to size. And we're going to do that over on the bandsaw again, just like the larger polycarbonate tube. How exactly I'm going to light this tube up, I'm going to go over in a second video. This video is just going to cover the bodywork and making of the physical portal gun itself. A part 2 will be a guide on how I installed a bunch of cool electronics into this prop. So stick around for that one. So now that we know that everything fits together well, we're gonna disassemble it again so that we can add more paint details to it. So we're going to start with this piece here. This is a large white piece that goes on the back. So there's this seam, intentional seam line that runs all the way down this piece, and from in-game photos that's supposed to be black. This is a Tamiya masking tape. This is the 6mm version. About to run out, need to grab some more. This stuff is amazing for masking off hard surface details or any masking really. You have such fine control over where you put this stuff because it's so thin. So I'm just going to line it up right on this line and go all the way down. Also, this is yellow tape, which generally means that it's a low tack tape, also called delicate surface tape. This helps ensure that you don't peel off the layer of paint below the tape. Also, I've let this high gloss white paint sit for about a day and a half or so before I start doing this kind of work, because when you don't have a full cure, the paint will like to lift off the piece. So I've just done these pinstripes here just to make sure I don't get any extra paint from the brush onto the white, because white is very, very hard to get black paint off of, or any kind of dark color paint off of. So really any black paint for this will work, so I'm not concerned about brush strokes or anything like that, but I am going to use a decent brush. I'm just going to get a little bit of paint on the brush. So this is going to take a couple of passes. You want that layer to dry a little bit just so it doesn't move around anymore before you start adding the next layer. This type of paint dries really quickly because I think it's acrylic based. So just to speed it up a little bit more, I got this heat gun. I'm going to put it on low and be very careful not to melt my 3D print, but just give it a nice dusting of hot air. So the portal gun has the Aperture logo painted on the front grip on the back portion, and there's two on either side, so we have to capture that. I don't have any fancy tools like a vinyl cutter, so I'm going to have to do this the old-fashioned way. However, I do have a 3D printer, so we're going to print out a stencil first. So using that 3D printed stencil, I'm just going to go ahead and trace it onto some blue painter's tape. And I'm using a mechanical pencil to trace this at first, because it's the only thing that's long enough to reach all the way down in there and trace around the shapes. And I can't quite see it really well because it's pencil, so I'm just going over it with a Sharpie real quick on all of the different shapes. If you take your time, you should be able to cut it out with no problems at all. After we remove what we don't want, we can apply that straight to the print where we want this to be painted onto. Just be sure to carefully apply it. You don't want to distort or stretch any of the shapes while you're putting this down. Alrighty, now we have that stencil laid down on that grip section. It's time to mask the rest of the grip section so we don't get overspray and accidentally paint the white piece we want to stay white black. And here I'm just going in with an X-Acto knife again to kind of clean up any lines, and this would be the point to add more tape if you need it. Alrighty, now for the really fast and fun part of this process, we're going to paint the stencil. So keeping this spray paint at a 90-degree angle to the part, I'm just going to do a quick couple of passes on there. All I'm doing is making sure I have an even coat. I don't want to go thick to avoid any paint seeping under that stencil. And in about 2 hours, when that paint has dried to touch, you can peel that stencil off. Just be sure to go slow. You don't want to accidentally peel off the black paint, because sometimes the black paint from the stencil is stuck to the black paint that's on your part. So just be careful when you're liberating that tape. And there you go. We have one Aperture logo painted onto the side of this grip. So it's just rinse and repeat for the other side. And in this case, we can just reuse that stencil we made and put it on the other side, mask the rest of it, and then paint it at a 90-degree angle again. I'm adding electronics into this build, so I'm not permanently affixing really anything as of this point. Everything's just kind of friction fit. So I'm not going to glue the inner tube inside of the larger tube yet, but I am going to glue the couplers into the gun itself so I can just slide that tube in there and have it hold in place. I'm using hot glue to do this because it fills in that tiny gap that I left for that tolerance, which was 0.3 millimeters. Next up on the list is to make what I'm going to call the emitter plug, which is this little guy right here. So this little piece sits inside of the barrel of the gun, and the reason this little piece is getting its own segment is because it has this clear piece of plastic behind it. And the reason it has this clear piece of plastic behind it is because I want the LEDs that will be behind it to shine clearly through that piece of plastic, so I don't have a bunch of little dots of LEDs. I want it a uniform glow. First off, obviously, I printed the black piece that's in there. I could have just printed it in black filament, but it was in blue, so I just painted it black after the fact. Then I just traced a circle onto my plexiglass at the desired diameter, and I brought it over to the bandsaw where I rough cut it. So I just cut a square roughly about the dimensions I need, and then I cut all of the corners off just to remove excess material. The next step is to take it to a disc sander. This is my old janky eBay disc sander, which the belt has since broken on. Actually, while I was making this video, it busted on me, so.
Whoops. I finally gave out. This poor thing.
That's unfortunate. But as you can see here, I'm just sanding the edges to that Sharpie line that I made. After I've rough sanded that to about a circle at the right diameter, I'm going to peel off the protective coating on both sides, and then I'm going to sand both surfaces with a 220 grit, and this will make the surface a milky white color. So instead of the light going straight through this clear piece, it'll scatter throughout that milky surface. Now it's time to permanently affix the black detail piece that I printed to the clear piece. So I've just marked it out with a Sharpie here, and now it's just time to stick it down with some super glue. And as you might be able to tell, the circle I sanded isn't quite the right diameter. As you can see, the little spokes don't meet up at the circle where they're supposed to. So to remedy this, I just brought it back to my disc sander and sanded everything flush. And then the blade emitter is done. It's as easy as that. I could have just left the barrel open and no one would have noticed anything different, but I think this little bit of detail really adds to the prop overall, because a lot of people see it from the front. And once we have electronics in there, I think that glow will look really nice. There's one last bit of detail that we do need to add though, which are the wires that stick out and go into different parts of the portal gun. So I found that the cable that plugs into your TV to the wall actually is the perfect diameter for this. So I'm just going to cut off the ends real quick, and then I'm going to just test fit that wire into that slot, measure about how much I need, cut it again, see how it looks. And I'm just going to do that for all the sides. In the reference images, the wires are a little more bendy than mine kind of came out to be. So to fix that, I'm just going to run a heat gun over those wires. It'll make the metal and the rubber within that wire more pliable, and then I'll be able to shape it to however I want. So as you can see here, I'm giving the top wire a little bit more of an arc as it goes back into the main body itself. And for the bottom two wires, I'm just going to more or less get those into position of how I think they should go based on the reference pictures. And that wraps up part 1 of this part 2 series on the portal gun. As I've mentioned before, part 2 will be all about how I installed electronics into this guy. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be coming out with a lot more content for you guys in the future. And if you don't want to miss any of my future videos, consider hitting that bell. You'll get notifications on whenever I upload a video. And as is the case with every project I make, there's tons of stuff that I would go back and fix if I had the time. But on the whole, I'm really pleased with how this came out. And I hope that you guys like it too.